Hey everyone, welcome to the Christians in Culture podcast, and welcome to this episode, season 2, episode 4. This is the third episode in a mini series we're doing related to COVID vaccines with Lauren McKnight from our Camden congregation. And if you haven't checked out our previous 2 episodes, I'd encourage you to do that. In the first episode of this mini series on vaccines, which was actually season 2, episode 2, we chatted with Lauren around the issues of immunology and the science of immunology and the creation of vaccines and all those kind of questions. And then in our previous episode, we took time to address all the concerns related to side effects that come from vaccines. And in this episode, we are going to dig into the question of who to trust. Can we trust the FDA? Can we trust the TGA? Can we trust the TAGI and all the other organisations with long initials? Can we trust the government? Can we trust the media? Can we trust what we read on social media? What about all the different positions and perspectives that there are? There's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of misinformation circulating. For those of us that aren't in the know, it can be very confusing to know where to go. Well, Lauren is going to answer those questions for us in a balanced way. She's going to help us to navigate that minefield so that we can be confident in what we are listening to, and that we know that we're taking on board the stuff we should be and ignoring the stuff that we shouldn't. So here we go. Let's get into this interview, with this final part of this interview with Lauren now. All right, well, let's talk to this mistrusted authorities then, which is come up in various different formats. Someone said there seems to be constantly a fear-based narrative. I pick up, you've mentioned the word afraid of long COVID and lots of stuff. So there's that fear-based narrative, and that's being coupled with this sense of we're forcing people to get vaccinated because we're spreading a message of fear. What would you say to that whole idea of a fear-based narrative?
Look, that's I think a very nuanced conversation there. I think we throw this, fear-mongering concept around very easily. But the thing is that what's happening at the moment, the global pandemic and everything being disrupted, and it's scary. And it's scary because it's unfamiliar, and it's scary because it's something that's outside of what we can control. And so losing our sense of control creates fear, like that always happens. And so, and yes, people will always use those sorts of scary situations to manipulate us, and those who would have ulterior motives, whether they be whether they think they have good motives or whether they don't, that can be used as a tool of control. And so we need to be really careful. We need to be really self-aware of who is making us afraid. Is this something that is an actual risk, or has this risk been overstated? And I think there are a lot of things here. So have the risks of COVID been overstated? Well, maybe. If you're terrified that you're going to catch COVID and surely die, then okay, that might be an overstated risk, because most people who catch COVID don't die, and I don't think anyone is denying that.
No,
but it's about which aspect of it is being emphasized. Is it a valid fear that if COVID becomes widespread in our community, that the number of people who require ICU and who deserve the ICU and the best treatment that modern medicine can give them, is it possible that will overwhelm the system, and so some people will end up not getting the best possible care? Well, yes, we've seen that in other countries.
Yes.
That's fully consistent with the statistics. And so that is a valid thing to be worried about. And therefore something that we should be taking actions to prevent. And that's why we're seeing these unprecedented levels of government control. And it's beyond what we would ever accept normally. there's no way we would ever allow our government in the free world to restrict our movements the way that they are doing now. But we also have given them a mandate to protect our health.
Yeah.
And so, the only way that they can keep their promise to meet our medical needs is by putting on these levels of restrictions. And yes, we should be having conversations about that, and we should be making sure that there's no overstepping of powers and things. But no one's winning from having the world locked down. There's no economic imperative to keep people in their homes. It's crippling economies and governments. And so there's no motive to keep lockdowns happening. In fact, the government would very happily get us all back to spending and making money as quickly as possible, and certainly they will. But we know that you can't just leave COVID unchecked. We've seen what happens when countries either do that intentionally or simply through lack of resources, is that it quickly overwhelms and the economy is going to be crippled one way or another.
Great thoughts. So if I can sort of bring, I guess, a theological perspective to that a little bit and add that on from my area, I guess, of expertise and having this conversation. If you listening to this, watching this, and you're vaccine hesitant, or you've got someone in your family who is, I think especially if it's this concern around, the government is spreading a fear message or fear mongering us, I think it's worth asking the question of yourself or somebody else. Whatever you do, don't try and just jump in there and straighten out fear with fact, because fear is an irrational thing. So all the facts in the world will not overcome someone's genuine fear, because fear is fear or flight. It's basically, it shuts down our ability to think, doesn't it? But helping a person by asking questions and maybe asking yourself and saying, okay, well, are there areas where I'm fearful? What fears am I experiencing in myself that I might be vaccine hesitant? Am I afraid that the government is holding out on me? Am I afraid of something? Because fear will be motivating all of us in some way, shape, or form in this matter. So don't be afraid to ask yourself what you're afraid of, is how I was thinking of putting it. Because and not all fear is bad. I mean, like you were saying there, if there's a genuine fear that we're going to overwhelm our health system and we're not going to be able to care for the most vulnerable, that fear is there for a reason. That's there that we would do something about it, not just ignore it, dismiss it. So, and the other thing I would say to this, friends, is sometimes we've got to do it afraid. I was talking to Pastor Jeff Baxter, our associate at the Rule, and he said, look, he came to the point where I'm about to turn 60. I've had a good life. If the risk that I'm going to get a blood clot and die, I'm prepared to take that risk for the benefit of other people. So, there has to be a sense of we've all got to give up something here. And I am concerned at times that a lot of times about our rights and all this sort of stuff, whereas Jesus is all about giving up our rights and taking on some of that acceptable risk because of the not just the benefit for ourselves, but the benefit, not even just the benefit for our family. I've heard people say, well, I'll do it I wouldn't get vaccinated except I'll do it for my family. But Jesus takes it a step further, and he says even the pagans do that. He basically says even the pagans, do good to those who do good to them, love those close to him. But Jesus says, hey, you guys got to go further. You got to love your enemies. So, it's that sense of let's do something over and above. Let's give up something. Let's take some risk for ourselves for the benefit of other people who we may not even know that we're actually benefiting them. But, so that's a little bit of a theological, ethical dilemma to run with. Don't just allow yourself to shut down because you're feeling afraid.
Yeah. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning here is that it's not, there's concern that the government is using fear to reach a particular outcome, but there are also, we're very quick to assign a negative motive to
the government
other side, right?
Yes. Yeah, I know where you're going with this.
The people who are telling you that the vaccines are full of toxins, the people who are telling you that there are deaths that have been covered up, they have a motive, they have a worldview. Again, whether they are they have a malicious intent or not, they are pushing a point. They have influence and power to be gained, that there is certainly money to be made. I remember there was a comment in the comment section that said, follow the money. It'll tell you where the problem is. And I said, oh, good, thank you. I followed the money. It led me to Facebook and Amazon. And I realized that, all this conversation is simply to get clickbait.
Yes, that's right.
Tongue in cheek, of course. But I did a little bit of desk research, and I looked at the CEOs of
yes, tell us about this information, Lauren. This was fascinating.
I'm like, okay, people are saying about all this money that Big Pharma is making, and obviously, look, to be honest, I think that if you can save the world from a global pandemic, you deserve to make a fair bit of money from it. But all that aside, are they really making that much money? Now, yes, the salaries of the bonuses of the CEOs of these companies that come up with the vaccines, they were like 100-fold bigger than normal because of these wins that they had gotten of landing, getting a vaccine through to the global market in a pandemic. Good, big reward. All right, but how does, and it's hundreds of thousands of dollars or even over $1 million in a year. And that's ridiculous. Like, how could one person ever get that much? But if you look at those top earning CEOs in the pharmaceutical industry and compare it to your top footballers, your top celebrities, CEOs of technology companies and media companies, they are you
right.
Can't even see them on the graph. I was like, I'm going to make a graph. I'm going to use a log scale, but we don't understand log scale very well. So I'm just going to leave it on a linear scale, and we're just going to have to go, by the way, go a meter that way, and you'll find Kyle Jenner.
yeah, that's right.
I can't fit them on the graph.
Yeah.
So we need to take some reasoned, and it's hard. We want someone to blame. We want to believe that we are in this horrible situation because of corporate greed, because corporate greed is really easy to blame. And don't get me wrong, I hate corporate greed, but they didn't cause COVID. Unfortunately, it's it goes along with tsunamis and earthquakes as being just one of those things that happens in our broken world.
Yeah,
and
am I correct that one of the companies is Astra, or is it Pfizer BioNTech, are not making any money out of the first round of vaccines or something? Is that correct, that they were giving them at cost price or something?
Yeah, look, certainly, they certainly don't have to worry about that. There's certainly going to always be support for vaccines, and if you have a successful vaccine and the boosters from it, there's going to be
enough
plenty of market for it, right? It's something everybody needs. It's the best product you can have is something that everybody needs. And so that's great. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that there's no actual such thing as Big Pharma. There's not like a team Big Pharma and that has a leader and whatnot.
It's a highly competitive market normally.
Highly competitive market. If there was so much a whiff of antitrust behavior, trying to get around the it's one of the most tightly regulated industries, probably the most tightly regulated industry. If there was any hint of trying to bypass that, their competitors would be on them like there is no goodwill in the pharmaceutical industry that would allow them to conspire against the population.
Which makes it all the more incredible that we've had the level of unprecedented collaboration that we've had at the moment to be able to get this happening.
I would like to say that that's mainly at the scientists level. No.
That's the scientist, not the pharma level, is it? You guys are all working behind the scenes incredibly well. Yeah. Okay. Good. All right, that's helpful. What about the concerns around the transparency of government expenditure, any conflicts of interest, that kind of thing? I know we're getting into an area that is not necessarily your area of expertise, but I gather you had some thought around this from what I understand.
Yeah, look, I think the regulatory systems that are in place around this they're not set by the industry. They're set really externally, and they're set by people who you know, I always think you want to look at people's motives and you want to look at the fruit of their work. Right? So what is the motive of, say the Therapeutic Goods Administration? They are motivated to protect and to make sure that any approved treatments meet the highest evidence quality that's required. If we wanted to go down the ivermectin route, which I don't think we necessarily should, but that's proof. The reason why it's not approved is because it didn't meet the strong efficacy requirements that exist. When I look at the motives of the TGA, they align with my motives. They align with what I would want to see of protection and good evidence.
Some of that comes back to what I talked about in my first episode of this season, which was it ultimately boils down to a trust issue. It's who do you trust? Do you trust the TGA or do you trust somebody else? Because the argument that people will be using is going, yes, but the TGA stand to gain, or someone stands to gain by the COVID vaccine, therefore they're fabricating or they're not publishing the correct results around ivermectin. And we've got politicians standing up in Parliament, in Parliament waving ivermectin brochures around saying this has worked. So it ultimately, it does come down to trust. It comes down to, do I trust that in the Western world, I'm hearing people saying we're living in a totalitarian society and we're living in a socialist republic and all this kind of stuff. And I feel like thinking it's actually, first of all, it's quite disheartening. And I wouldn't want to be a person living in China or a person living in North Korea and hear us Westerners saying that, because it's actually, it must be so insulting to people who are really living in genuine totalitarian regimes with the level of freedoms we have in the West and the level of accountability we have. Yeah. We're not even close to that scale. And so it ultimately does boil down to trust. And for me, it's, well, I'm going to trust that the vast majority of people, our system is set up in such a way that the vast majority of people will, put it this way, the ones who, the things that come to the top and get approved is because of a rigorous approval process where the majority of people agree. And I guess that does kind of lead to something you were saying the other day, and I know you wanted to talk to this, because, a lot of the accusations that people brought forward and we hear is, well, anyone can find evidence to produce it. Anyone can produce a group of doctors that say such and such. And those that are dissenting against the status quo of the FDA or the TGA, they're being gagged or whatever. And that seems to be quite a prevalent concern. It did come up in our survey results. What do you feel about that? What would you say to that?
Yeah, the narratives that we tell in society, even around science, are often very individualistic. And so, we love this underdog story of the scientist that everyone thought was wrong, but actually turned out to be right. And those stories do happen. New findings are often contrary to the existing paradigms. But that's the good thing about science, is that you do an experiment in a way that's reproducible, and someone else can come along and reproduce it, and they'll try, and then those theories certainly do shift. But that means that you are cooperating in the sort of corporate scientific method, which is not an individual pursuit. Science is a collaborative effort. And scientists don't really like confrontation. And so what we tend to do when someone is outside of that and is going against the way science works is we'll just tend to sort of, okay, you don't really represent us. And so I get that looks like they're being oppressed, they're being gagged, they're not being allowed to publish. The reason that they're not being allowed to publish is because what they're saying is not good quality science. Yeah, right. So
is that where the whole peer review process comes in? I mean, people will say, "Oh, this article has not been peer reviewed yet." That's what you're saying. Peer review process is I'm submitting this to the science body and they will evaluate my work, and at some point they'll decide whether it's valid or not. That's the normal process you're alluding to, is it?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And look, some of that has needed to be not bypassed, but just rejigged a little in COVID, because the peer review process takes a fair bit of time. And so even before COVID, there was some moves to do something called pre-publishing. So as soon as you have a study, you'll upload it on a server so that other scientists can get access to it faster. But you always know, like you're not allowed to base grant applications or other research papers on something that's just a preprint, but it gives you that sort of ability to get on the front foot. So there's been lots of that happening. Yep. But what you can't do is do a study, didn't really work, maybe you pre-printed it, but no paper's going to pick it up because it's poor quality. And then so what you do is you go to the fringe media and you
or
start
a random politician.
Right. And you go, hey, no one's listening to me. And the rest of science is going, that's because like it's not good, it's not right. Like
it's not good science.
Yeah. Right. And then, I'm being gagged, I'm being suppressed, I've lost my job, they're trying to silence me. And it's like, like, what do you want us to do here?
Right. So people have attached to that underdog mentality there.
Yeah.
Well, I was listening to some a lecture about the story behind that British scientist that published a paper back in 1998 about the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and was linking it to autism. And realizing that he was completely outed, and it was that he was being funded by lawyers that were trying to lodge class action. But the thing that struck me the most about that was long after he was not allowed to practice, that the hesitancy, the vaccine hesitancy, or the vaccine rates in the UK dropped dramatically, well below herd immunity, and there were outbreaks of measles everywhere. So the damage was done long after he was even stood down. So with that in mind, I can understand why the science community would be wanting to try to avoid that happening, because the potential, it's not just one person. With our propensity as a society to latch a hold of that underdog mentality, we could actually go against public health. What's good for the public health? Is that part of the reason, the fear, the concern?
That's absolutely what we're seeing. You know, it's really hard to know how to talk, because I really do understand where the general population is coming from, and I get that when there's so many voices circulating that it's really hard. But on the other hand, it makes me really, really angry to see to see it become identity politics, and to see it become even a religious matter. So you'll see there's data starting to come out of the United States that white evangelicals are like identifying as a white evangelical is associated with not just right-wing politics, but also vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah.
And then the other studies is that vaccine hesitancy is, the main cause of not being vaccinated, and it's the unvaccinated that are dying. And so you connect those data together, and it's Christians that are dying in these increased rates in Florida and countries like that, and that is like, we should be not okay with that.
No, we should be the opposite. That's how I feel. I 100% think that we as Christians should be not standing up for our rights. This is not, it's never right to stand up for our rights as Christians. If our rights happen to be the same as the minority, maybe, but we should be standing up for those who cannot speak up for themselves. And my view as a pastor here is, once again, I'm not speaking for C3, but my view as a Christian leader is I'll give up my rights and encourage my church to give up my rights for those who cannot speak up for themselves, the marginalized, the immunocompromised, the people who genuinely aren't able to get a vaccine because they've got other reasons, and so on and so forth. That's what I'd be encouraging people to do, not stand up for our rights. I think that's the opposite of the gospel, to be perfectly honest.
And look, if we might need to really strongly preach that message if the risk benefit, and if there really was a detriment to us for the benefit of others, then we might have to work a bit harder to preach that message. Yeah. But it protects, the data is good, the these are effective, and the side effect profile is low.
Yeah.
As far as medical interventions go, this is it should be a no-brainer. And where Christians should be spending their energy, if you ask me, is access to vaccines for developing countries.
Yes.
Like, it is criminal that people
I agree.
who are born into poverty are not being able to get access to these vaccines. That's what we should be fighting for.
Meanwhile, we're talking about third doses for ourselves, and this is the crazy thing about it, is that in poor hygiene, in the third world, in poverty, while people aren't being vaccinated, we actually not that we're focusing on ourselves, but we're potentially doing the world a disfavor, because it's in those environments where more mutations are likely to arise, a higher chance of them arising in that part of the world. Is that not correct?
No, absolutely. And that's, COVAX, the organisation that exists to try and, partner internationally to try and share the vaccines. They say that we don't beat COVID until we beat it everywhere.
Everywhere. Yeah. Great thought.
This really is like we're all in this together. Like, we need to fight this as a united, and, I think everyone can agree that fighting COVID is a valuable thing to do. Yeah. Like, it should be completely bipartisan. There's no reason for this to be a source of debate and dissension, but people want debate and dissension. They want someone to blame. They want to score political points out of the unrest. And I think we really need to be standing up and saying, hey, that's not okay.
And that's something we as Christians can do. Let's be justice-minded, and gut justice and care for all is a central part of the doctrine. I mean, that's a big part of the underlying theme behind this podcast, really, and our worldview. Talk about worldviews. My worldview is that Christians, we are called to interact with our culture and bring the kingdom to earth, and we do that by finding ways to love our neighbour and not stand up for our rights. So this is one perfect way to do it. And sadly, I'm seeing what appears to be quite the opposite. And I know that I've backtracked in the worldview, and I understand the philosophy that leads some down that path. So I'm not saying everyone's evil. I actually do think that there's a theological underlying premise that leads people in the direction of what you're talking about there. We're not going to wear masks in church, and we're not going to be vaccinated, and all those things. But often backtracks back to a parting of the ways theologically, and I come back to the point where, fundamental to my Christian faith is not standing up for my rights, but speaking up for others, and caring for the poor and the needy and the marginalised, the widow, the orphan, and ultimately that's what over and over again. I know I'm talking theology now, but over again, that is what the Old Testament prophets were constantly reprimanding the Jews for. It was that they didn't do those four things. They didn't care for the poor, the widow, the foreigner, or the orphan. They became elitist. They looked out for themselves at the expense of others. And that's the mandate of the Christian church. That's how we bring the kingdom to earth, friends. We do it by giving up our rights and benefiting other people. And so that will lead to, I believe, that the natural byproduct of that will be things like COVAX, like let's share the vaccines, let's be willing to take a hit for the team, and so on, all that kind of stuff.
If we have a problem with big pharma profiting, then what we need to be doing is putting pressure on the pharmaceutical company to use some of those profits to give free vaccines to developed countries. That should be the Christian pressure that's getting put on pharmaceutical companies.
And there are ways to do that don't involve standing up for our rights. Exactly. That's not about us. That's about the third world. It's about helping somebody else. So
if you were giving up your vaccine to help, to give it to, then maybe I'd be okay.
I'm with you. No,
unfortunately, that's not an option we have.
No, that's not an option. No. What about untrustworthy statistics, particularly things like underlying morbidities? We've noticed, like at the time of recording this, a large proportion of people dying are being stated they had significant underlying morbidities. I've seen memes of people with arrows through their head saying, well, I better do a COVID test to be sure, but I'd say, you've probably got COVID, not being dead from an arrow through your head. So there's obviously mistrust around the way death rate is being reported there. I would imagine that's a very complicated process, because you've got to measure it against everyday death rates and so on. But what would you say to that untrustworthiness of the statistics, or the concern that those statistics are being reported in an untrustworthy way?
Yeah. No, look, I think it's less of a concern now than it was. I think, everybody knows someone who works in healthcare and, who's seeing the COVID wards. There's no denying that people are getting very sick from COVID and dying. That I think when you're removed from it and when all you're seeing is reports from other countries, then you do begin to wonder. But I think it's hit our shores enough now that we can see that, people are getting a flu-like illness, testing positive for COVID, and then they're having this very now predictable sequence of events that is resulting in them being ventilated and passing away. I think if you just want to look at statistics, it's the excess deaths. So if you look at worldwide mortality rates, they have absolutely spiked. And it is complicated statistics. You do have, to account for the fact that people die, like they do. And so if a lot of people are getting COVID and dying, you have to understand that a lot of those people would have died anyway. What I find interesting is that the understanding is somehow flipped on its head when we talk about people who are dying after having the vaccine. So exactly that same argument. If you're going to vaccinate your whole population, we need to understand that some of those people were going to die already. Yeah. And so, again, some complicated maths needs to take place to make sure that we're not seeing an increased rate of death due to the vaccine. That would be worrying. And that's what we talk about, the reporting and the statistical signals. And so they, that's why they have the adverse event reporting mechanisms. So
people can report any adverse reaction, can't they?
And so that really is a type of citizen science, and you have to be very careful with data that comes from citizen science. Normally you would just completely discount that, especially if it's a biased issue. You could easily sway that data, and even subconsciously that data is going to be swayed because people are going to be, hearing about vaccine reactions, and then anything that happens to them in the weeks after vaccine is going to be attributed. So we're going to get that bias naturally. And
could it be also fair to say that we might be underreporting on actual side effects? Because some people go, "Oh, I got a sore arm," or Jill didn't report anything to say she was sick. So it's not a controlled group, is it? That's the point you're making. Whereas in a proper trial, there's a control group which get a placebo. It's supposed to be a diverse aspect of the population. They take into account regular death rates. All of that sort of stuff is all done. It's complex mathematics, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So in the clinical trial, the phase 3, with the thousands of people in each group, tens of thousands in each group, they did diaries. So they had to fill out a diary every day about symptoms they were experiencing. They were targeted for ones that, things like autoimmune disease and inflammation-related conditions. There were specific questions about those. They go looking for adverse events that, and also there are unsolicited ones. So anything that happens gets reported. Once it's out, once it's been approved, temporary, like provisionally or emergency use or any approval, then it goes to a monitoring phase. And so there's surveillance, but there's also this anyone can report. And so then the statisticians look very carefully, and what they look for is these statistical signals. And so that's how they were able to pick up the clotting issue. So, lots of people are, say, having strokes in the 4 weeks after the vaccine. But hold on, lots of people have strokes anyway. They did the maths there. No, the vaccine isn't increasing the rate of clots, of strokes. we also seem to be getting some reports about people having this autoimmune related thrombocytopenia. So this TTS type clots. Okay, they're usually a little bit rarer, and we are seeing that they're a little bit more common in our vaccinated population. And again, as you said, lots and lots of people, lots of data, we can pick up these incredibly rare events. And so then they're able to establish, yeah, it's really rare, but it's real.
But it does happen.
It really is happening. And they're seeing similar things with the younger males with the heart inflammation.
Yes. Yeah.
Again, usually self-limiting, but a bit of a worry and something we should watch for. Again,
hence they flag it as a potential side effect. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Again, the prevalence of that particular complication with COVID infection in that age group far outweighs.
Right.
Plus all the other potential problems with COVID. Even if the risk of that particular complication was exactly the same, you'd still opt for the vaccine.
So to put this all in a layman's term, where there is obviously a lot of concern in the general public about the trustworthiness of information. We hear things like, well, people can make data say whatever they wanted to say, and all of that. So I think a couple of things that I'm drawing out of what you're saying is, one, because we understand that, proper authorities put into every possible conceivable contingency they can to minimize that risk with control groups and everything else. So proper regulated data, while maybe not being able to completely remove that, makes it much more minimal in comparison to anybody just plucking some figures out of it, like we're seeing on social media. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that then when the figures come out, I'm also seeing people quoting or misquoting information that's in there, rather than allowing the professionals, these really intelligent mathematicians, to actually be the ones who tell us what the data really says.
Yeah, because people go, I've seen some Twitter posts, oh, look at this report out of the TGA and it's saying that this many people died. They're not telling us that. It's like, no, it's publicly available information.
Yes.
It's being interpreted appropriately by 90% of the population. And there is no controversy here, except for that which is being manufactured for the purpose of influence and click counts.
So once again, where does it come down to? It comes down to, who do you trust? Well, I choose to trust that there are mathematicians who know what they're talking about, and they will model this and they will give us the information. And then, rather than just because I read it on the internet, it must be true kind of thing. Okay, so I guess that's, in the end, we're not going to convince people who are otherwise, but hopefully we're just giving you some food for thought there, which is to realize that there are really smart people who are paid well to do this, to do the science and do the maths. And somewhere along the line, we've got to be humble enough to realize, well, I don't even have a science degree or a maths degree, so I've got to trust that there are some people who know what they're talking about, who I can rely upon, who are good people trying to do the best they can. And as a scientist, we haven't really touched on this, but as a scientist, it would be the same for medical professionals working with COVID patients. I imagine it's actually quite disheartening to see how much work you put in, how much you genuinely want to do something and invest in the common good, and to see it pulled down by people who don't understand it must be quite disheartening. Am I right there?
Yeah. Look, it is. And
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
no. I think I've shared exactly that with you, but it is, but it's not like, oh, woe is me, people aren't listening to me. It's not that at all. There have been a lot of pieces put out by emergency physicians, especially in places like Florida, where it's just, they've given their lives to trying to help people. They've shared as much as they can the information about the most effective way to reduce risk. And then people are coming to them and they're unable to help them, and that is heartbreaking. When someone turns to you and says, "Doctor, help me," and I can't, I tried, you didn't listen. There's nothing I can do now, and I will continue to put my life and my family's life in danger by exposing myself to you. But this is not okay. There is a lot of disheartened medical professionals out there. Scientists less so. We're used to being ignored. But
you're right in that sense. Medical professionals working the front line, working, putting their lives their families' lives on the line, in much the same way that the early Christian church did this. Back when we didn't have medical science and the plagues and all the rich people shot through, and it was the Christians that stayed in town, many at the risk of their own life, many lost their lives to help and nurse the sick and the poor. And it was the same as what our frontline medical staff do now. And they deserve more from us than disdain. I actually feel like it's disrespectful and it's actually not loving to them, because I don't know what it's like to be dressed in PPE for 8 hours. Apparently they're wearing multiple layers. I can't imagine how hot it must be, how hard it must be emotionally, and they deserve our thanks and I to be fair, 90% of the population recognise that, but it's just that there's a small portion that seem to ignore that or aren't even perhaps aware of that. That's how their actions are actually playing out with these people.
Yeah. And look, let's be fair, it's not the vaccine hesitant people that have caused that. It's COVID that's caused that. And I think we all need to direct our grief at the virus.
Right.
Something I was writing, I quite liked the phrase, it's the brokenness of the world condensed into a tiny viral particle. Like,
that's such a good thought.
It is our frailty, it is our inability to control nature, it is all the things that we wrestle with as humanity, and it's happening. It's what we feared, a global pandemic. It's here, and really no one is to blame. We want to blame people, and surely there have been some imperfect responses along the way. Now there are some people who want to now put the blame on the vaccine hesitant, and that's not accurate either.
That's not going to help either.
That's it. But I think sort of stripping all that away, this is not a culture war. This is humanity together fighting an awful virus.
Thanks. That's great thoughts on that, Lauren. And as a Christian, I've been talking with people lately, and I've been saying, the question we need to be asking ourselves is, what does love look like for every one of us? What does it look like wherever we sit on this issue or any other social issue? Love looks like laying down what we want for someone else. And so thank you. I mean, I feel convicted even realizing how I said that. It sounded like I was saying those that were vaccine hesitant were, I was trying, in the essence of trying to stand up for medical people. I probably came across as though, I'm sure most vaccine hesitant people aren't like that, but let's just continue to support one another and love one another through this process. So great thoughts there. You touched on media a bit, the big media companies. There seems to be too much trust or not enough trust. What advice do you give to people when it comes to where do you advise people get their information from when it comes to media? Yeah.
So I think that is a really common, tactic of misinformation, is to portray the mainstream perspective, the widely accepted perspective, as being just a construct of mainstream media, as if I've had a lot of people say, if you just look beyond what the media is telling you, you'll find ... and that is offensive. Telling anyone that all they're doing is just blindly accepting what a news channel is telling them is insulting. And certainly I don't know many people who do get all of their information via a mainstream media source. So certainly looking beyond the mainstream media is perfectly wise, and we need to know that every media channel has a particular bias and a particular set of KPIs. They need to get clicks, they need to get advertising dollars, and so we need to look, as I've said before, the motives and the fruit. So when it comes to your personal health decisions, just like you would for any other medical treatment, talk to your GP. I hope that people would have a doctor that they trust. And look, I do recognise as well that some people have not had positive experiences with mainstream medicine. They have found more benefit in alternative medicines, and so that then makes it difficult, because if the alternative medicines are the ones who are engaging in some of these mistrusts, then and mainstream is the one saying to get vaccinated, then I understand that struggle. And so I think we all need to, as much as we can, try and recognize the places where we are operating out of our worldviews, where, okay, my social circles are telling me this. Is that really true? And so, find a scientist to help you. Like if anyone has particular, I don't necessarily want to, engage in fruitless arguments.
No,
I don't think that's particularly productive. But if there's a particular statistic that you feel is really weighing on your mind, seek out those alternative explanations for the data that you're seeing. It's easy for me because I've got, medical researchers as yes. colleagues and friends. I know that not everybody has that advantage. But
even coming back a step to media, I think there's a couple of things come to mind. I mentioned this in the last episode. It's being aware of the fact that media does have its bias, even starting there and recognizing that. I think there's at times I think there's an underlying assumption that if something's on a television screen or it's on a YouTube channel that it must automatically be correct. And it does have a bias. So it's understanding that, like you said, it's understanding that there are financial implications why there's all kinds of reasons why media would put something out there. But not all media is necessarily bad. I mean, there are good journalists who, in the same way there are good doctors and good scientists trying to do things, there are good journalists that are trying to do good investigative journalism or good reporting as well. So it's not like we throw media out either. It's just simply being aware that it's not a regulated industry to the same degree that we're talking about when we're talking about science and medical industry. It's the level of regulation basically means that in Australia you can't have a monopoly on newspaper and television. But you can have, if you have 49%, theoretically, but you can have 49% of the market. I mean, and you can do it's not regulated to that degree. So it's just being aware of that.
I think then, as little regulation as there is around the mainstream media, there's even less around social media. That's correct. And so, we love our YouTubers. We do. And they speak our language because yes. they can target just our tribe, and as humans, we find our tribe and we love to be feel included. And so I think we need to also be really aware of the biases that exist around social media and the complete lack of control and regulation. In fact, if there is control or regulation, it's in a negative sense in that,
it's control to generate more income. it's
polarizing.
That's correct, yes.
If we want to go right back to the beginning and talk about an immunological concept, the reason that T cells join their little categories, so like your Th1 or your Th2, it's because they start to make a little bit of one particular chemical, and then that tells them to make more. And so when you make more of it, then you make more of it, and it's this positive feedback cycle that it's called T cell polarization. And that is exactly what social media.
That's what the social media is doing.
You read a little bit of something, and then it'll feed you a little bit more, and then you read it more, so it'll feed you more, and it is legitimately polarizing, and it's designed to do that because it captures our attention so well. And that's
so I've talked about that whole concept repeatedly on the podcast, and I've said you've got to trick the algorithm. You've got to deliberately force yourself to find an opposing view and do that in the event that you can do everything you can to get yourself outside your echo chamber. That's the terminology for it. And we hear more of what we want. And so I think it's just being aware of that. I'm not saying don't go to media, don't go to forces, but just let's have enough nous about us to recognize that we are going to have to work very hard to go, okay, I see that article. Let me find something that completely contradicts that and measure the two side by side, force ourselves to do that. And as you're saying, I hadn't really thought about that until you put it in that letter that I read at the beginning. That flies in the face of our own sense of looking for safety. And I haven't never really been able to articulate it that way. So thank you. But it makes us feel unsafe to do that very thing, doesn't it? To go outside our comfort zone. So,
and I hate it. I hate clicking on, because I often go looking for misinformation to see what's out there, and I hate clicking on it, and I'm I'm giving them clicks. No.
That's funny.
But you need to keep that broad intake.
Yes, that's how
a varied diet.
A varied diet, very good. So we've got some questions around it seems like there's waning efficacy against the variants. The new variants are coming. In with that, we've got people saying, well, it doesn't actually stop the virus from transmitting, so why bother? First you said 2 doses was going to be enough. Now you're saying we'll need boosters, that kind of thing. And the last thing in that category was, well, what about the safety for those who aren't or can't be vaccinated? So all of that it's perceived as misinformation, but I think it's just we're learning as we go is how I would perceive that. But what would you say to that?
Look, right from the beginning, we knew that the lengths of protection was going to be problematic. We knew that coronaviruses generally, immunity doesn't seem to hang around for very long. And that was there was so much scrutiny at the beginning to see if people could get COVID twice. Are we actually getting our natural immunity, or can you get reinfected? And then there were a few cases of people that were reinfected, and we go, oh, okay, now is that the exception or is it the rule? And so, that, COVID hasn't been around long enough for us to have gone through enough cycles of, like the common cold. We know that we get it, and then a little while later we'll get it again, and we probably won't get it again that year, but, we'll, and influenza, our immunity actually lasts well, but the virus mutates so quickly.
The virus mutates much quicker with the influenza virus, doesn't it? Yes.
So, this is something we're figuring out. And it is really going to suck if it turns out that to continue to be protected against COVID, you need to get a vaccine every 8 months. That is going to be highly problematic. And we're going to need to come up with something as a...
Why so problematic? And what are your thoughts on why?
Nobody wants to go and get an injection every 8 months.
Okay.
A
lot of people do that for the flu virus every year, do they not?
That's right. And if it turns out that COVID settles into a seasonality, then we might be okay. And, if it turns out that maybe we can even combine our COVID shot and our flu shot, and we'll do it once a year, and that'll be fine. Okay. But if it turns out to be more often than that, I think that's going to be problematic, especially when we're talking about underdeveloped countries or developing nations where that sort of, a yearly vaccine is, even a yearly doctor's visit would be a privilege. So I think that would be unfortunate. But that's not, again,
it's not insurmountable.
The blame for that is on COVID.
It's on the virus,
And right now, when all of humanity is being exposed to this virus for the first time and health systems are being inundated, now, if ever, is the time to be vaccinating the whole population.
Right. It does seem to me, well, I've seen quite a few comments on social around that, and that seems to be leading to this mistrust. I've always thought of it as, we call it practicing medicine for a reason. I mean, it's not an exact science. In that sense that it's an adaptive science. Science by nature is constantly changing and adapting to circumstances and learning as you go. And that doesn't, a simple example I give is that, this time last year, or, March last year, people were talking about the virus spreading on surfaces, and that was the primary way it was spreading. And now we know, no, it's droplets. But that's not a sense that they're feeding us wrong information. And actually, to me, it's a sense that they're prepared to adapt and change. They're not sticking to their guns. They're prepared to go, well, we're learning as we go. Isn't that a good thing? I think that's a good thing, to be honest.
Yeah. At first, we thought that for the general population to wear masks was a silly idea.
Yes.
Because it was, it was using up supplies because, global supply hadn't caught up
was
yet.
So low.
That was probably quite valid. But second, we thought that it was not likely to reduce transmission. And now we
understand
what it does. It's not perfect.
Well, even some stats that came out. I was listening to the the ABC's Coronacast recently, and they were talking about Israel there, and they were saying they were comparing the statistics with the spike since they've opened up in Israel and the spike in the UK, and both have spiked since their freedom days. However, they were saying that the hospitalisation rate in the UK is not tracking at the same rate as the rise. however, it was tracking fairly much the same in Israel. And there was two possible reasons why, and it may be one or both. They said, one, it could be that Astra has a longer, because most people in the UK tend to get Astra, so more than Pfizer. So it could be that Astra is lasting longer. But the other thing they simply said is the fact that, as you said, the Israelis were among the first in the world to get Pfizer, and it could just be that the vaccination is starting to wane there now. So it's evidence for a booster shot. And I guess that's also, you might know more on that, but that seems to be.
There's also real nuance around the age cohorts, and we're not good at dealing with risk. We're definitely not good when you have to then segregate it by age. That's just way too hard.
Yes.
But so in Israel, it was the elderly that got vaccinated first, just like here, they were prioritized.
Yep.
And so it's now the elderly whose immunity is waning. And so the hospitalization rate is increasing disproportionately just because that's the group who it's been the longest since.
Who's been the longest time.
The maths is incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
And any one statistic taken out of place, out of the wide body of scientific understanding, can be misinterpreted.
So trust the science, friends. Trust there are people who know what they're talking about. I think that's
and who legitimately have your best interests at heart.
Yeah.
I think that's a message. No one's these scientists are not having their pockets lined. Like, we wish we would get some of the
you work hard. You just sure.
But yeah.
Well, that was a marathon effort. Have you got anything else that you wanted to add? I think I've covered everything on the list. Thank you for your time. But have you got anything specifically you wanted to add, or something that's come to mind that we haven't discussed that you want to bring up?
No, I think that is more than enough of my thoughts.
Oh, Lauren,
on record.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. That I really pray that will be encouraging and helpful. So thanks everyone for being with us, and please feel free to share this with anybody that you might have in your family or extended family who might like some answers. Lauren, thank you for your investment into your time, your knowledge, and giving it on this evening for the better part of 2.5 hours of time just to be able to give up that time to help other people is really appreciated. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Well, that brings us to the end of this 3-part series on vaccines. I'm so glad that you joined us for those episodes. I hope that they encouraged you, brought you a level of calm and confidence that you can represent Jesus well, you can answer people's questions. And let me just round it all off by encouraging you to keep asking the question of yourself, what does love look like? What does love look like? Regardless of whether we're talking to people who have a different perspective to us, to be Christians in a COVID culture, to be Christians in a polarized culture, we need to keep asking ourselves, what does it look like to love our neighbor? What does it look like to be gracious and loving towards those who we might not agree with? Let's keep that kind of attitude, because I believe above all else, that's going to help us to be effective Christians in a COVID culture. And I look forward to being with you in our next episode of the Christians in Culture podcast.